Why do we keep fighting each other? This isn't just some fleeting question. It's an echo that's bounced through the ruins of ancient cities, whispered in the marble halls where peace treaties were signed. And now it shouts from the polarized debates that fill our social media feeds. In a world that prides itself on being civilized, enlightened, and advanced, why does the urge for conflict just stick around? Think about it. Societies that build incredible cathedrals, inspiring museums, and groundbreaking universities are the very same ones that build weapons, raise armies, and carve out battlefields. And even more unsettling, why is it that even when things seem peaceful, individuals still manage to create enemies in their everyday lives? We project hostility onto colleagues, neighbors, strangers, and sometimes even onto the people closest to us. War, despite what we might like to believe, isn't just some rare, abnormal event that pops up during a crisis or at the hands of a tyrant. It's a deep, profound expression of the human mind, an ancient pattern rooted in both our biology and the social structures we've built throughout history. From the earliest tribal communities to the complex states we live in today, the impulse to fight hasn't vanished. It's just changed its clothes. The battlefield might have moved from forests and plains to digital arenas and corporate boardrooms, but the fundamental logic of war? It's still very much alive, operating in the shadows of human behavior. This video is going to propose a bold idea. War isn't an isolated event, but a recurring symptom of unconscious forces that span cultures and eras. These forces are fueled by fear, by a deep-seated need for control, and by what Jung called the projection of one's own shadow. We'll be drawing on insights from other incredible thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault to really dig into this.
Understanding the psychological and historical roots of this phenomenon isn't just crucial for grasping the armed conflicts that plague our world, it's also essential for recognizing how these same dynamics shape our daily lives in personal rivalries, political disagreements, ideological divides, and even those small, constant clashes that permeate our everyday existence. Throughout this journey, I'm inviting you to look beyond the usual oversimplified explanations. We'll explore how war, whether visible or invisible, continues to shape who we are and how we connect with each other. And more than that, you'll be challenged to reflect on your own role in this ongoing cycle. Can truly understanding these forces open a path to personal and collective transformation? Because in the end, the fundamental question isn't just why we fight, but how can we stop fighting against each other, against the world, and even against ourselves?
To really grasp why humans insist on tearing each other apart, we can't just look at modern conflicts. We have to peel back the older layers of history to literally dig into the ancestral soil of humanity. For thousands of years, there was this popular belief, the myth of the noble savage. Thinkers like Rousseau popularized it, and it was carried on by romantic movements. The idea was that in prehistoric times, humans lived in perfect harmony with each other and with nature. It was civilization, with all its institutions and power structures, that supposedly corrupted this primitive peace. But over the last 50 years, archaeology has brutally challenged this romanticized view. Archaeologist Lawrence Keeley, in his eye-opening book, War Before Civilization, paints a pretty grim picture of our past. He scientifically documents with chilling detail that war is as old as humanity itself. At archaeological sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, the evidence is undeniable. We're talking skeletons with unmistakable arrow marks, skulls fractured by club blows, and rudimentary walls clearly built to protect villages from attack. In some regions, over 20% of the skeletons found in prehistoric cemeteries show clear signs of violent death. These aren't just isolated incidents, they are a clear, undeniable pattern. The first farmers of Neolithic Europe, for instance, built their villages surrounded by ditches and defensive palisades. These weren't just decorative elements, they were massive structures built with immense collective effort in direct response to a very real and constant fear. War, far from being a rare event, was a part of everyday life. Keeley estimates that the rates of death from violence in these pre-state societies were actually much higher than in the industrialized societies of the 20th century, even when you factor in both world wars.
But primitive war wasn't solely driven by economics or the desire for more territory. Pierre Clastres, in his profound work Society Against the State, offers an intriguing perspective. For many indigenous societies, waging war was, paradoxically, a way to prevent tyranny. In these groups, the political structure was deliberately designed to resist the centralization of power. Leaders often didn't have coercive authority. Their role was more symbolic than governmental. External conflict, in this context, served as an internal regulator. Keeping groups in a constant state of mobilization actually prevented the emergence of a dominant elite. So war here wasn't just a means of survival, but an instrument of social balance. This ancient panorama forces us to really rethink our more comfortable notions about human nature. The impulse for conflict wasn't introduced by civilization, nor is it some historical accident. It seems to emerge from something much deeper, a psychic need that appears to transcend cultures and epochs. The act of creating an other, of defining an enemy, has always been fundamental to building a group's identity. Defining who we are almost inevitably requires defining who we are not. So from the earliest times, war has shaped not only territories and political boundaries, but also myths, beliefs, and the very symbolic fabric of human societies. However, this leads us to a more unsettling question. Is war merely a reflection of historical and social circumstances? Or is there, rooted within each individual, a biological impulse, an ancestral drive that pushes us to combat and even destroy the other? To explore this darker, more intimate dimension, we need to dive into the territory of philosophy and deep psychology. Because if war began in the fields and villages of prehistory, today it continues right inside the human mind. And that's exactly the path we'll follow next. War isn't just a historical or social phenomenon. To reduce human conflicts merely to disputes over territory or resources would be to completely ignore a far more unsettling dimension: the fact that the impulse for conflict is hardwired into the very fabric of the human psyche. To understand it in all its depth, we need to turn not only to archaeology and history, but also to philosophy and psychology, the very ground where some of the greatest thinkers have tried to grasp the true nature of humanity. Thomas Hobbes, in his monumental work Leviathan, laid out a brutal and profoundly clear view of the human condition. For Hobbes, in our natural state, humans aren't peaceful beings. We're driven by fears and desires that put us in constant competition with others. Without a strong, central power to regulate our actions, individuals would inevitably tend to devour one another. Hence his chillingly famous maxim, "Man is a wolf to man." In this scenario, war isn't an exception, it's the natural state of human relations. Peace, on the other hand, is a fragile construction, only maintained by structures of power and the ever-present threat of punishment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered a different, yet equally revealing perspective. For him, primitive man was peaceful and free, but was ultimately corrupted by the emergence of private property and social institutions. In this process, inequality was born,
and with it, conflict. War, in Rousseau's view, was a product of civilization, not of inherent human nature. However, even Rousseau recognized that the desire for domination, once awakened, could take deep root in the hearts of men. Sigmund Freud, in his seminal work Civilization and Its Discontents, delved even deeper. For him, the impulse for conflict arises from an innate drive, the death instinct, or thanatos. Each individual, he argued, carries within them a destructive impulse that needs to be controlled and sublimated for civilization to even function. But this impulse, Freud maintained, never completely disappears. Under pressure, it erupts, manifesting itself in acts of violence, intolerance, and war. Freud famously described civilization as a field of constant tension between eros, the impulse for life and union, and thanatos, the impulse for destruction.
So, from Hobbes to Freud, a disturbing picture starts to emerge. War isn't just some occasional aberration, it's a direct, or often sublimated, expression of impulses that live inside all of us. It's not the other that makes us go to war, it's something within us that projects onto the other the image of the enemy to be fought. And here's where an even deeper, more unsettling concept arises, that of the shadow, developed by Carl Gustav Jung. According to Jung, every human being carries in their unconscious a repressed part of themselves, dark aspects, fears, unacceptable desires that simply can't be integrated into the image we build of ourselves. This shadow, when unrecognized and unexamined, tends to be projected onto others. The enemy, then, becomes the literal receptacle of all the qualities we reject in ourselves. It's through this projection that conflict feeds itself and perpetuates. War, ultimately, is the externalization of our internal battles. But if the impulse for war arises in the unconscious, if it's fueled by the shadow and these deep primal drives, then a crucial question emerges. How are these forces manipulated, amplified, and directed by power structures? Who actually benefits from the constant creation of enemies? To understand this, we need to move beyond just psychology and into the realm of discourse. It's time to shift our analysis and explore how power organizes and legitimizes war.
If war truly emerges from the deep impulses of the human psyche, then it's in the projection of the shadow that we find one of its most powerful and insidious mechanisms. Carl Gustav Jung dedicated a significant part of his life's work to exploring what he called the shadow, that collection of impulses, desires, memories, and aspects of our personality that our conscious ego rejects, represses, and tries to hide away. But here's the thing about what's denied. It doesn't just disappear. On the contrary, it gains strength in the unconscious, constantly seeking ways to manifest itself. The projection of the shadow is an almost inevitable phenomenon. When individuals and entire groups fail to recognize their own flaws, insecurities, and darker impulses, they end up projecting these very qualities onto the other. The enemy, then, isn't some objective, real figure. They become a psychic construction, shaped by everything we refuse to admit about ourselves. This is how entire populations become capable of seeing another group, an ethnicity, a nation, a religion, an ideology, as the absolute embodiment of evil, the ultimate threat, and existential danger. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his profound work on the genealogy of morals, pushed this idea even further. He showed that much of what we call morality often arises from resentment. It's a feeling of powerlessness and inferiority that, when it can't be dealt with directly, transforms into a sense of moral superiority. When we're unable to act directly on our own shadow, we, the moralistic person, attribute all the evils of the world to the other. Hatred of the enemy, therefore, isn't just some simple reactive emotion. It's a sophisticated product of self-deception,
a cunning way to preserve a self-image of purity and righteousness.
This process isn't abstract. It has very real, lethal consequences. When a collective projects its shadow onto another group, it literally opens the door to dehumanization. And dehumanization is the absolutely necessary step to justify violence. History is absolutely full of examples, propaganda campaigns that portrayed entire peoples as barbarians, as parasites, as subhumans. Every genocide, every ideological war, every political persecution was preceded by a deliberate, symbolic act of enemy construction. An enemy who, in reality, was often nothing more than a distorted, dark reflection of the very society that created them. This dynamic hasn't vanished with modernity. If anything, it's become even more sophisticated. Today, communication technologies and social networks amplify the processes of projection and polarization in ways we've never seen before. Social media, especially, functions as a relentless factory of enemies. Algorithms, which are designed to favor polarizing content, actively fuel anger, reinforce prejudices, and build these suffocating discursive bubbles where there's absolutely no room left for dialogue or empathy.
The language of war has become incredibly commonplace. Politicians accuse their opponents of being enemies of the nation. Commentators speak of a cultural war. Hate campaigns go viral in a matter of minutes. The rhetoric of elimination, the idea of completely defeating or eliminating an opposing viewpoint, has become normalized, even far outside the military field. Increasingly, people are led to see the world through a Manichaean lens. On one side, we are the virtuous, the enlightened, the just. On the other, they are the ignorant, the amoral, the dangerous. And the more radicalized the narrative becomes, the harder it is to recognize the basic humanity of the other. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that inevitably leads to conflict, whether symbolic or physical. In times of crisis, this psychological need only intensifies. The greater the fear, the uncertainty, and the sense of powerlessness, the greater the temptation to find a scapegoat. The collective shadow desperately seeks a channel for its discharge, and leaders, whether consciously aware of this mechanism or not, can skillfully exploit these raw emotions, directing popular hatred against a convenient target. The external enemy, real or invented, becomes the ultimate instrument to consolidate power, unite warring factions, and justify authoritarian measures. Therefore, to truly understand how human beings continue to create enemies and perpetuate the logic of war, it is absolutely essential to recognize that the enemy, before being a real adversary, is fundamentally a psychic construction. It is the distorted mirror that allows us not to look at ourselves. But who builds this mirror? Who shapes the narratives that feed this fear and hatred? For this, we need to enter the realm of discourse and power, and that is precisely where we are headed next.
War doesn't just spring from deep instincts or unconscious projections. It is, above all, constructed. It's built through the careful weaving of language, images, symbols, and narratives that profoundly shape how we perceive the world. The power of words is immense. With them, it's terrifyingly possible to transform a human being into a monster, a neighbor into a traitor, an entire nation into an existential enemy. Discourse doesn't just describe reality, it actively creates reality. Michel Foucault dedicated his groundbreaking work to analyzing exactly how power operates through discourse. For him, institutions, whether the state, the media, religious organizations, or the educational system, don't just control our bodies and actions, they also meticulously shape our consciousness. They define what can be said, what can be thought, what is considered true or false. And in this incredibly powerful process,
They create the symbolic field in which the enemy will be meticulously constructed. Every sustained conflict absolutely requires a narrative. It's not enough for one group to simply want to fight another. That desire must be profoundly justified. And the most effective justification is one that presents itself as objective, unquestionable truth. This is how national mythologies, religious doctrines, and rigid ideological beliefs emerge, defining the us and the them. The enemy is always portrayed as a fundamental threat, a threat to order, to morality, to the very existence of the group. Every nuance, every complexity is meticulously erased. The other becomes absolute. Either they are destroyed or they will destroy us. Zygmunt Bauman, in his chilling analyses of modernity and its horrors, showed how supposedly rational and civilized societies can be led to commit unimaginable atrocities, not because their members are inherently monsters, but because they were immersed in powerful discourses that justified violence as an act of defense, purification, or even progress. The Holocaust, for instance, wasn't just the result of blind, irrational hatred. It was meticulously prepared by a massive discursive apparatus that constructed the Jew as a biological threat to the purity of the nation. Similarly, the massacres in Rwanda, the Soviet purges, the colonial wars, all of them were preceded by extensive campaigns of symbolic construction of the enemy.
Today, in a world absolutely saturated with information, this process hasn't disappeared. It's only fragmented and accelerated. Social media functions as perpetual factories of enemies. Algorithms that are designed to favor polarizing content actively fuel anger, reinforce prejudices, and construct these tight discursive bubbles where there is literally no space for dialogue or empathy. The discourse of war has become chillingly commonplace. Politicians accuse their opponents of being enemies of the nation. Commentators speak constantly of cultural war. Hate campaigns can go viral in mere minutes. The rhetoric of elimination, of utterly defeating or erasing an opposing viewpoint, has become normalized, even far outside the traditional military field. Increasingly, people are led to see the world through a simplistic Manichaean lens. We are the virtuous, the enlightened, the just. They are the ignorant, the immoral, the dangerous. And the more the narrative radicalizes, the harder it becomes to recognize the basic humanity of the other. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that inevitably leads to conflict, whether symbolic or physical. But if discourses shape the battlefield, it is also through them that we can begin to attempt to deactivate the mechanisms of war. To do this, it is first necessary to recognize how these powerful narratives operate in our daily lives, even when we are not in a context of declared war. Because even in times of apparent peace, the same patterns of hostility and division remain actively at play. And it is precisely on this hidden dimension that we will delve deeper next.
If war, in all its pervasive forms, physical, symbolic, everyday, arises from deep, often unconscious forces, then the true battlefield isn't the external world, it's our own interior. As long as these forces remain hidden, they will continue to dictate our reactions, our judgments, and our relationships. As Carl Jung so powerfully taught, what does not become conscious manifests as fate. And in this particular case, the collective fate of humanity has been an endless repeating cycle of conflicts and divisions. The absolute first step to breaking this cycle is the recognition of the shadow. And not just the collective shadow, that which we project onto social groups, nations, or ideologies, but also our individual shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we desperately prefer to deny. Think about it. Fear, resentment, envy, the insatiable desire for control.
the persistent need for moral superiority. All these impulses, when unrecognized, become potent fuel for conflict. Awareness of this dynamic requires immense courage. It's truly not comfortable to confront your own darkness, to recognize within yourself the very same impulses you so readily condemn in others. But it is precisely this uncomfortable movement that allows for genuine transformation. The more a person is able to integrate their shadow, the freer they become from the compulsions that relentlessly lead to hostility. You begin to recognize in the other not an absolute enemy, but a fellow human being equally complex and contradictory.
Freud already pointed out that civilization requires a constant repression of destructive impulses. But Jung went further, showing that mere repression isn't enough. It simply feeds the return of the shadow in even more violent, uncontrollable forms. The true solution is integration, bringing to light what has been denied, giving conscious space to those dark impulses so they can be understood, processed, and ultimately transformed. This is a process that requires not only individual work, but also a profound collective effort. Societies that genuinely encourage critical reflection, deep empathy, authentic dialogue, and sincere self-knowledge are far more capable of reducing levels of hostility and avoiding the insidious traps of projection. On the other hand, societies that repress questioning, that actively feed fear and polarization, inevitably move towards increasingly intense forms of conflict. But how do we practically initiate this process of awareness and transformation? How do we apply these principles not only in our personal journey, but in our relationships and in our broader social life? To answer this, we need to explore concrete strategies, tangible paths that allow for the reduction of these bellicose impulses and the creation of genuine spaces for reconciliation, both internal and external. This is precisely the focus of the final part. Recognizing the presence of the shadow is the first step, but the true challenge is to integrate it in a conscious and productive way.
A path forward, conscious living, collective peace. If we are unable to truly deal with these intense internal impulses, we will continue to project them onto the world, relentlessly perpetuating the cycle of conflict and hostility that has scarred human history. That's why the path to reducing war, both external and internal, demands a profound transformation, a deep commitment to self-knowledge, to the development of consciousness, and to the constant mindful practice of empathy. The first dimension of this transformation is undeniably individual. There are no shortcuts here. Each person must bravely confront their own beliefs, fears, prejudices, and resentments. Jung warned that the shadow doesn't just disappear, it absolutely needs to be integrated. And this only happens when we learn to observe our own thoughts and reactions, especially in moments of tension and conflict. Why do we feel that surge of anger? Why do we instantly demonize the other? Where does this impulse to win, to humiliate, or to exclude truly come from? When we can look at these emotions without judgment, but with radical honesty, we begin to dissolve their destructive power over us. Beyond this crucial introspective work, it's essential to develop daily practices that strengthen our capacity for empathy and understanding. Active listening, engaging in authentic dialogue, and cultivating a genuine willingness to see the other person's perspective. All of this significantly contributes to disarming the logic of war that sadly prevails in so many human relationships. Genuine compassion isn't a weakness, it's a powerful antidote against the unconscious mechanisms that fuel conflict. However, this transformation cannot be limited to the individual. It must expand to the social and cultural structures that shape our very imagination. We desperately need to question hate speech, challenge harmful stereotypes, and dismantle language that constantly reinforces the us against them mindset. Educational institutions, media, politics, All these spaces need to be fundamentally rethought so that they do not perpetuate the narratives of war. This requires a profound cultural change, a new way of telling our stories, a new ethics of coexistence.
Practices such as peace education, the development of emotional intelligence, and the deliberate cultivation of open dialogue environments are concrete, tangible paths for this collective transformation. Societies that actively promote these values significantly reduce the risk of violence, not because they magically eliminate human impulses for conflict, but because they offer conscious, healthy means to deal with them. On a more intimate level, transformation also involves a fundamental shift in how we relate to ourselves. It's necessary to abandon that incessant internal battle, the severe self-judgment, the relentless emotional repression. The more a person can reconcile with their own shadow, the less need they will have to project it onto others. The ultimate result of all this is not some utopian dream of absolute peace, something that may never be fully achievable. Rather, it's a more conscious society, less reactive, more capable of containing and transforming the destructive impulses that we all carry. And this is a work that truly never ends. It's a continuous path, not a final destination.
But for this path to truly make sense, it's necessary to take a step further, to reflect on how these profound principles can be concretely applied in our daily lives, in our relationships, at work, in politics, in culture. How can we genuinely live in a way less guided by the impulses of war? How can we practically create spaces of peace in a world that insists on dragging us into conflict? This is precisely what we have explored throughout this journey. We've seen that war isn't an isolated phenomenon in time, nor an event exclusive to the battlefields. It is a continuous manifestation of the deeper forces that inhabit the human psyche. From the earliest tribal societies to today's social networks, the impulse to create enemies, to divide, to project onto others what we fear in ourselves remains a recurring, stubborn trait of the human condition. And this leads us to an inevitable realization. The true battlefield is not out there. It is not in the trenches, in political arenas, or in ideological confrontations. It is within each of us. As long as the shadow is not recognized and integrated, it will continue to be projected. We will continue to unconsciously seek external enemies who can bear the weight of the aspects of ourselves that we simply do not want to face. We will continue to be seduced by simplistic narratives of good versus evil that endlessly feed resentment, anger, and division. We will continue to be unconscious instruments of a cycle that perpetuates conflict in all its forms, from war between nations to the silent war we wage in our personal relationships and even within ourselves.
Transformation begins when we courageously accept this uncomfortable truth, that the other is not the true threat, but the greatest enemy is the ignorance we have of ourselves. As Jung taught, the integration of the shadow is the very path to individuation, to a state of greater wholeness and authenticity. But this path is anything but simple. It requires courage to look within, to confront fears and impulses that we would much prefer to keep hidden. It requires humility to recognize that all of us, without exception, carry in our psyche the seeds of hostility, intolerance, and violence. And it requires discipline to cultivate daily practices that help us not to act reactively, but consciously. This transformation is also profoundly collective. It is not just an individual journey, but a necessary cultural change. We need to create spaces that genuinely favor self-knowledge, authentic dialogue, and empathetic listening. We need narratives that do not feed fear and hatred, but instead invite us to recognize our shared humanity. Every small gesture truly counts.
the way we handle a conflict at work, the patience we offer in a difficult discussion, the conscious choice not to perpetuate discourses that demonize the other. These are not grand, sweeping actions, but it is precisely these accumulated small acts that gradually, powerfully, change the very fabric of human relationships. We must abandon the illusion that we will one day be able to eliminate all conflict, but it is possible and absolutely urgent to learn to deal with it in a more mature and conscious way, because war only persists where unconsciousness reigns. Now, I invite you to reflect. What patterns of conflict do you recognize in your own life? How do you deal with your own shadow? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experience can truly help others see themselves more deeply. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is absolutely the time. Here we always seek to go beyond the surface, bringing reflections that challenge, that disturb, but that also deeply liberate. And don't stop here. The next video is essential for those committed to this process of transformation. Watch it now. It may bring insights you have yet to explore and that will be important on your journey.